It's my great pleasure to welcome you here to King's College London. My name's Ian Henderson. I'm the director of the college's Menzies Centre for Australian Studies. Tonight is an exciting night for me. It represents both a culmination and a starting point for a new starting point for the Menzies Centre. It's a culmination of a series of negotiations between King's and the University of South Australia to really develop the First Nations, Australian First Nations program here at King's, engaging with Indigenous scholars from the full breadth of research in Australia and also here at King's College London. As something of a flagship for our knowledge exchange that we'll be undertaking over the coming years, we are delighted to be inaugurating tonight the David Unaipon Lecture for 2017. A special welcome to Irabinna Rigney, who is our speaker tonight, but more about him in a moment. So allow me firstly to acknowledge the First Nations people of Australia as the first peoples of the country where I was born, and peoples of diverse and great strength of culture who have survived and thrived into contemporary Australian modernity, and I think are a great source of the innovations that will bring Australia into the future. Speaking of Australia, it's now my very great pleasure to invite to the stage the Deputy High Commissioner for Australia to the United Kingdom, Matt Anderson. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, thank you, Ian, Professor Lloyd, and the Chairman of the Menzies Centre, John Douth. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Firstly, I'll just apologies for Alexander Downer, the Australian High Commissioner. He very kindly gave most of his staff leave over the summer break, and so now it's his week off, so he's having a welcome break with his wife, Nikki. So I'm speaking today. And it's my great pleasure to introduce the inaugural Unaipon Lecture as part of the annual King's College and the University of South Australia Aboriginal and Contemporary Australian Studies Fellowships. This marks the beginning of what we hope will become a long and a vibrant relationship between King's College London and the University of South Australia. I'm pleased that this annual lecture will provide a platform to talk about contemporary Australian issues and share and showcase Indigenous knowledge on a range of fields which will assist with an understanding of the First Nations peoples, both in Australia and here in Europe. The Australian Government acknowledges the significant contribution and the role the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their cultures play in contemporary life in Australia today and indeed on the world stage. I commend King's College, through the auspice of the Menzies Centre for Australian Studies and the University of South Australia, for forging this new partnership, this fellowship and the annual lecture under the name of the Ngarrindjeri man, David Unaipon, described as Australia's Leonardo da Vinci. David has been pitched on the front of Australia's $50 note since 1995. A hugely intelligent man, he nevertheless left school at 13, and he lodged 19 patents in his life. He revolutionised sheep shearing, and he devoted much of his time to attempting to achieve perpetual motion. He wrote prolifically, he conceptualised the helicopter 2 decades before it became a reality. Many parts of Australia's history continue to impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples today, but there is a current of hope, progress and cultural pride amongst Australia's Indigenous peoples, with discussions underway about the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and the Australian Constitution. As a nation, Australia is committed to achieving reconciliation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, recognising their history and their humanity and righting the wrongs of the past. Momentum towards reconciliation, stemming from the 1967 referendum, where 50 years ago Australians overwhelmingly agreed that the government had a duty to make laws to the benefit of our First Peoples, from recognition of the native title, the national apology to Australia's Indigenous peoples, and our commitment to the rights of Indigenous peoples around the globe, has been highlighted in Australia's candidacy for the United Nations Human Rights Council. And it's continuing to build as Australia grapples with our national identity and the value and the respect given to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Earlier this year, Australia's Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, delivered the 9th Closing the Gap report. Closing the Gap is a government strategy that aims to reduce disadvantage amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with respect to life expectancy, child mortality, access to early childhood education, educational achievement and employment outcomes. And it's a formal commitment made by all Australian governments to improve Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and equality within 25 years. And while this report showcases that real success is being achieved across the country by individuals, by communities, by organisations and by government, as a nation, the stark reality is that we are only on track to meet one of the 7 Closing the Gap targets this year, 1 in 7. Our Prime Minister has said at the time of this delivery of the report that we are not on track to meet the ambitious targets that we've set, and we must stay the course. The Prime Minister also underscored the importance of building a new way of working together on these important issues by putting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people at the centre of the decision making in their regions, and recognising that culture is paramount to finding the solutions that respect, acknowledge and support identity. Here in the UK, the Australian Government partners with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to promote their culture to the world, as well as working closely with the relevant communities on important cultural heritage matters, such as the repatriation of Indigenous ancestral remains from British institutions and museums. Tonight's lecture, the David Unaipon lecture, will examine the state of Aboriginal education in Australia and report on research being conducted that examines how teachers enact culturally responsive pedagogy in Australian mainstream middle schools. This lecture could not be more timely with the finding of this Closing the Gap report. I'm delighted that Professor Lester-Irabinna Rigney, one of Australia's eminent and most respected Aboriginal educationalists, is going to deliver this inaugural lecture. He's a descendant of the Narungga, Kaurna and the Ngarrindjeri peoples of South Australia, and he's worked with Aboriginal education for over 20 years. Professor Rigney, I would like to warmly welcome you to London for your lecture this evening, and I'm pleased that we're able to hear from you at this point in time about Australia's history and our relationship between non-Indigenous and Indigenous Australian peoples. Earlier this year, I also had the honour to host Deborah Cheetham, a renowned Australian sopranist who came to the High Commission as part of Reconciliation Week. She was one of the stolen generation, and she said in her recital that evening that the path from ignorance to knowledge passes through understanding. Tonight, we hope, Professor, that you'll give us further and more understanding of these important issues that face my country. I would now like to introduce Professor David Lloyd, Vice-Chancellor of the University of South Australia, who will speak more about Professor Rigney and the University of South Australia. Vice-Chancellor.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is David Lloyd. I'm the Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of South Australia. And I am really pleased and delighted to welcome you all here tonight for the inaugural David Unaipon lecture. This lecture is part of a new strategic relationship between the Menzies Centre here at King's College, London and the University of South Australia, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. I would like to acknowledge Mr. Matt Anderson for his introduction, Mr. John Delth, the Chair of the Menzies Centre Advisory Board, Ian Henderson, the Director of the Menzies Centre for Australian Studies, alumni of UniSA who've joined us here tonight, colleagues from King's College and from UniSA, and friends and supporters of the Menzies Centre and of UniSA. Just so you know a little bit of the history of the University of South Australia, the Times Higher Education rankings last week ranked us as one of the top 10 institutions in Australia. We're number 9, in fact, which we're quite pleased with. But we're also the youngest Australian institution in the world's top 250. UniSA is slightly younger than King's College. Last year we celebrated our 25th birthday. You can appreciate the kind of passion and energy then that we bring to building a young and vibrant global university. We position ourselves as Australia's University of Enterprise, and we're very much an institution that values our engagement with the wider world as much as we do our teaching and research back at base. When we became a university just 26 short years ago, our founding legislation, our Act, committed us to provide the tertiary education programs that we consider appropriate to meet the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We are the very first Australian university to make a formal commitment to reconciliation, and we've worked very hard at building the cultural change, supporting the projects that are needed and that will deliver better opportunities and outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff and students, and through them, their communities. which brings me to this evening. This lecture, as you know, is named for David Unaipon, an esteemed Aboriginal scientist and inventor, and also importantly an early advocate for the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. He's an Ngarrindjeri man from South Australia. The lecture is the centrepiece of a new programme which is jointly funded by King's College and UniSA, and which offers annually a suite of Aboriginal and contemporary Australian studies fellowships. The purpose of the fellowships and the associated research programmes and accompanying events is to promote in the UK awareness and understanding of Indigenous knowledge, the contribution of the First Peoples in Australia, and contemporary Australia's identity in the world. Professor Lester-Irabinna Rigney will not only deliver this lecture this evening, but he will also return to King's in 2018 to take up the first of these fellowships. Irabinna Rigney is one of Australia's most prominent Aboriginal educators. He's worked in Aboriginal education for over 20 years. He follows in the footsteps of his late mother, Alicia, who was a pioneer in Aboriginal education, a great woman. Before he joined the University of South Australia, Irabinna was the Dean of Indigenous Education at the University of Adelaide, Director of the World Tour to Aboriginal Education, and the Director of the Yugurand First Nations Centre at Flinders University. Irabinna is a descendant of the Noongar, Kaurna and, like Unaipon, Ngarrindjeri peoples of South Australia. He holds a doctorate by research and is a professor in our School of Education. Irabinna's professional and academic standing saw him inducted into the Australian College of Educators in 1998. He's recognised as an international authority in the area of Indigenous research methodologies. Interest in his work by national and international universities has seen him take up several prestigious visiting scholarships, including at Cambridge University here in the UK, at Fort Hare University in South Africa, and at the University of British Columbia in Canada. His topic tonight, Decolonising Pacific Schools towards an Australian culturally responsive pedagogy, will focus on what are shamefully poor educational outcomes for Aboriginal children and the need for new teaching methods. The academic divide between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal student success at school is an urgent international problem. It's an urgent international problem in the Pacific, and yet there has been no comprehensive review of the teaching methods. This is despite a growing body of evidence that shows that culturally responsive teaching improves academic success for Indigenous people in countries such as the US, Canada and New Zealand. Professor Rigney's lecture tonight will examine this very important issue. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lester-Irabinna Rigney.
Ini mari mai yung kerja juga minyak kapurka. Nai nari les gunu wajah ada Rigney. Yama Professor of Education at the University of South Australia. Ngai aja ni orang Ngarrindjeri Kaurna. Buku yang mono. Ngai terkena neli Rigney and yakana Iva Richi Burka. Mereka Kaurna yurta warabutu. Ipa Waringanga. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a real pleasure and honour to present this inauguration in memory of my fellow countryman, David Unaipon. As is my Narungga culture and custom, I would like to honour and thank those who have made this evening and this fellowship possible. In particular, I'd like to thank Dr. Ian Henson for all of his work in making this possible. Some of you may not know that David Unaipon and I descend from the same Aboriginal Ngarrindjeri nation in South Australia. Tonight I stand before you a proud member of the Narungga Kaurna Ngarrindjeri Aboriginal nations in South Australia. And I bring you greetings from the land whose totem includes Maori, the pelican, the Gurita, the shark, and Gilbruki, the ibis bird. The photo that you see behind me is of our elder, Mugi. And Uncle Mugi here is dressed in the way in which we Ngarrindjeri paint our dances. And these ancestral marks are older than the land that is Australia. So what we also see is the lands and knowledges of my people are quite old. And this is the markings of my of my mother's country, the Narungga of Stephen Goldsmith, who has passed. Garlabardi was an elder in our Narungga community, and we lost him just recently along with my mother. And, we're both really stalwarts in our Aboriginal language. That is a great loss. According to a new study published on the 20th of July in the journal Nature, Dr. Chris Clarkson's DNA genomic research confirmed the long-standing claim of Indigenous peoples that Indigenous Australians are the oldest civilization on the planet. It's around about 65,000 years old. And yet the imperial colonial presence in the Pacific is relatively young. The Australian continent was first decreed New South Wales by Captain James Cook just before he claimed possession of Australia on behalf of the British Crown, His Majesty King George III. On the 20th of August in 1770, James Cook raised the Union flag on Possession Island in the Torres Strait as he took possession of the entire eastern coast of Australia. The Australian government and its schooling system speaks to 229 years of Australian history. In this oration, I will examine how the 229 years of learning disengages from the 65,000 years of knowledge and re-engages new forms of teaching modernity. This can be seen in Foucault's basic idea of each era or epistem reveals a positive unconsciousness, a way of hegemonically seeing the world and constructing codes of culture written by those in power that govern language and the schemata of perception. 65,000 years or 229 years. And the 65,000 years of my community and my elders stand in the photo behind you. And these are some of the living legends who I've looked up to in the past. The two Australian icons who symbolise the contrast that I was speaking about is in the two Australian icons in this contrast of epoch are David Unaipon and Prime Minister Sir Robert Menzies. And indeed, one could argue, friends and colleagues, that the turbulent collision of knowledge systems which these two individuals represent have brought us to this very moment, for me to stand before you today. Aboriginal scientist, as you've heard, inventor David Unaipon speaks to this 65,000 years of Indigenous knowledges, but particularly these knowledges that were informal. They had an ontological and epistemological informalness about them. But they were philosophies of the Southern Hemisphere. A powerfully intelligent man, as you heard, left school at the age of 13, lodged 19 patents, and was excluded from wide education until the age of, beyond the age of 13. Now pictured on the $50 note, it's fondly known as Australia's Leonardo da Vinci, but such Aboriginal knowledge-rich enterprise was designed to meet the challenges of the South and in a context for Pacific populations to consume. Sir Robert Menzies, however, the longest-serving Australian Prime Minister, speaks for 229 years of the post-colonial formalised education imported from the Northern Hemisphere and designed to address political problems more akin to the North Sea and the Celtic coast and the Pacific. I never really lived under Robert Menzies' administration, as I was raised on a mission of Point Pearce in 1965, segregated from whites. It was illegal to live amongst them in my mother and father's day. And as I lived in 1965, it was 12 months before Menzies stood down as Prime Minister. And on the mission, we sang God Save the Queen at school and saluted her flag in 40-degree heat. When we played cricket, we wanted to be English winners like Botham, Gower and Gooch, whilst we left our peers to be the Australian losers. My introduction to Menzies was in 1998 as a visitor scholar to Cambridge University. Here I read his 1939 Declaration of War speech. And I also read his famous 1942 speech, The Forgotten People. I also read Anne Henderson's book at a later date on Menzies at War, and of course the insightful books of Heather Henderson, the collection of Menzies' letters titled To My Daughter and A Smile for My Parents. The Menzies era for Aboriginal peoples, Asian and Pacific Islanders, saw both credible social change and considerable political turbulence. Known as the founder of the liberal doctrine in Australia, he championed economic liberalism and secured and preserved and extended Anglo-cultural conservatism. Menzies inherited several white Australia policies to restrict immigration to keep Australia British and white. Despite the 1902 Commonwealth Franchise Act that disqualified coloured races from voting, Menzies amended the Commonwealth Electoral Act in 1962 so that Aboriginal peoples could vote in federal elections. In 1951, he introduced Commonwealth scholarships so the poor could access universities. However, critics of the left would never forgive Menzies' controversial policy to fund both poor public schools and already very wealthy private schools from the same public purse, as if these schools were equal. Menzies' administration also implemented the Assimilation policy in 1961 that forced my family and others like me to adopt norms, values and customs of non-Indigenous peoples. I am the colour of inequality. Whilst Aboriginal peoples could be grateful for Menzies, including us in his version of Australia, albeit in not ways that Unaipon would have approved of, but can we ever be happy that both him and Cook ever came our way? I will argue tonight that the history of territorial acquisition in the Pacific, before and beyond Unaipon and Menzies, have left two models of schooling that dominate approaches in Aboriginal education in Australia: the assimilative model and the culturally responsive model. These two live in permanent tensions to one another. My argument tonight will be that these debates remain unresolved and are in a fierce contest for the fight for power. Assimilation for Batiste is the imposition of one world view over a multicultural society. How do we shift pedagogically from assimilation to cohesion via schooling? This question keeps me up at night. And it's one that I'm deemed to try and solve. The significant challenge is to support teachers to reshape their methods of teaching, to respond to the educational needs of a modern multicultural classroom, thereby building diverse approaches to entrepreneurialism and cohesion. After all, isn't this the purpose of schooling? Schools, my friends and colleagues, do the work of the nation. Cohesion is learnt. Schools are our shelters and shade us from hate. Assimilation teaches for envy and fear, whilst peddling order and priority. To this invitation, we as scholars refuse. It is integration that marinates us in contagious hope. In post-colonial Australia, my friends, the news of Aboriginal success is not good. Something is not right. Aboriginal Australians have the highest youth suicide rate in the world, the lowest children's literacy in the country, and the highest rates of youth incarceration. This is not because we are poor. This is not because we were born this way. It is because of the structures we have inherited from the past in our southern Pacific. So government ministers and scholars today in my country and yours advocate the assimilation model. However, the research in Australia is quite clear. There is simply no evidence that the assimilation model improves academic success of minorities and Aboriginal peoples who have been colonised. Nor have I found any evidence anywhere, to the best of my knowledge, that Aboriginal parents only want their children to be taught in isolated Aboriginal learning systems free of Western influences. On the contrary, it has been scientifically proven over the last 3 decades ad nauseum that Aboriginal parents want schooling that both affirms their cultural capital, intermeshed with modern economic global environments. Moreover, there is an emerging science globally that culturally responsive pedagogies, teaching methods, does in fact improve the relationship between teacher and student, and therefore contributes to academic success across the Pacific with Native Americans, New Zealand Māori and Aotearoa, Alaskan Native children and First Nation Canadian students. Australia, the UK and many EU countries now face significant challenges as a result of increased flows of people contributing to increased cultural diversity and tensions around ethnic and cultural difference. Educational institutions as key sites for identity and social benefits for research, identity and social formation, are key players in sustaining social cohesion of nations. Schools do the work of the nation. There are significant benefits for researchers, teachers and policy actors from the UK, EU and Australia to dialogue about learning to live together in increasing culturally diverse societies. Educational disparities for marginalised groups and the global migration of people is a worldwide phenomenon of the 21st century. I argue that inclusion has become the central wicked problem of our time, surpassing climate change. I use this oration tonight to call upon global countries to urgently consider the impact of human mobility and multicultural over the next 5 years, as this will impact the next 100. If schools do the work of the nation for democratic cohesion, it has then become obvious to me that to enable students in schools from diverse cultural backgrounds in your country and mine to be successful citizens, it is important to adopt teaching methods responsive to and respectful of them as culturally situated. What has often been overlooked in the literature is relevant models of teacher approaches that underpin culturally responsive pedagogies for learning. So the questions that I want to ask here tonight is, how do we prepare schools and teachers with appropriate methods of teaching that give teachers agency to draw on the children's backgrounds and experiences they bring to class from home on which to build new knowledges? What theories of classroom practices can we go to that move teachers beyond deficit theories of students' ability born from colonialism in the Pacific? What skills do teachers need to enact responsive approaches that addresses our disparities, promotes pluralism, and promotes harmony and cohesion? The influx of new arrivals of forced migrants to our shores is nothing new to the hemispheric south. We have seen refugees from the north come to Aboriginal Australia. Scholars in the Pacific have embarked on redesigning old teaching practices inherited from colonialism that failed to work with and across differences, including girls, refugees, Maori, Muslim and Aboriginal students. As Hugh argues, in a world where the centre of the global and economic power is shifting from the North Atlantic to South America, Africa, the Asia Pacific and the subcontinent, the global South now offers the global North some really good techniques of cultural responsive pedagogy. However, the epistemological supremacy of the Northern Hemisphere no longer weighs sway in Australia. The distorted view of the South are disputed. The globalised power and status now that the South is exerting on the North is that you need to be able to interculturally communicate to us in order to trade with us, regardless of how standard you are in English or French. Southern experiences and expertise in cultural responsive schooling brings opportunity to the North to approach pluralism with a greater clarity than before. This is a decolonising project, my friends, that is more relevant than ever to the Northern context. Its immediacy has more pressing now, given the distorted and different ways multiculturalism is being framed at the moment, especially in the argument of Brexit. You will hear Aboriginal standpoints tonight, based on my journeys across the Pacific borders. I did my teacher training in PhD research in Australia. I have collaborations in Canada and New Zealand and Asia as a researcher and government policy advisor. I've written Indigenous education critical theory. I've been involved in large-scale empirical studies. And my current research is on Aboriginal schooling reform and cultural responsive pedagogies. For the past several years, I've been working in close partnership with Aboriginal Australians, Maori, Aboriginal South Americans, Native Americans and Native Hawaiians. In 2009, I, along with Professor Peter Buskin, reviewed the Australian directions under his leadership. The Australian review was on the Closing the Gap campaign. 8 years ago, I co-created Australia's first national Closing the Gap research clearinghouse for research, building the country's first large-scale evidence base for government policy to overcome Aboriginal disadvantage. I begin this paper by examining deficit-orientated approaches as the need to move beyond them in terms of their colonial effect. I then proceed to draw on global examples and advice of where to go. So how do we overcome assimilation and deficit theories to explain school failure? Well, deficit theories of education are a deep reservoir of explanation for the persistence of educational inequality in which the geographical North and South draw regularly to explain poverty and racism. They use theoretical descriptions, my colleagues, like disadvantaged schools, students as victims, or the Closing the Gap communities. Aboriginal students are often represented in minorities as powerless victims who are disadvantaged and are blamed for their own impoverishment in deficit theories. In writing about teachers' beliefs, Sleater points out that teachers commonly connect children with ascribed identities about their assumptions of their abilities that the teacher regards as rooted in the parent's level of education. An example of this in Australia is Alan Luke's longitudinal evaluation of Aboriginal Stronger Smarter program that found that non-Aboriginal teachers self-reported out of 700 interviews that their knowledge of Aboriginal cultures outside of the school were low. when Luke also interviewed Aboriginal students and staff, the majority of those interviews showed significant problems with teacher deficit views of culture. Stronger Smarter program earned the most money from the government over the last 10 years. It's the biggest review of public education we have in the country. We are finding it is deficit thinking of our students that need to shift. And as I've argued elsewhere, these deficit assumptions in Australian Aboriginal education stem from two key historical moments. The first being the British claim over Australia declaring terra nullius, or the land belonging to no one, when the settlers arrived in 1770. Whilst Aboriginal people never ceded sovereignty, Europeans were masked by the view as Aborigines as primitive subhuman, and civilisations that were uneducable. Representations later emerged in the 1900s that Aboriginal students arrived at school as empty vessels from which the teacher needs to fill. More importantly, representations that Indigenous kids were somehow mentally unprepared and required non-abstract hands-on learning, free of challenge, that matched their deficit learning styles. An example of both learning styles theory and compensatory education in Australia are the two main deficit-orientated solutions to disparity in Australia. Nichols, Crowley and Watt have scientifically discredited these theories and the learning styles racist stereotypes that purported in the way Aboriginal children learn different to whites. The second historical moment was the adoption of the Assimilation policy in 1961. This meant that mixed blood children could be removed from the cultural influences of their parents, as indicated that you might have seen in the Rabbit-Proof Fence film. All Aborigines were expected to become like white people in customs and beliefs. Aboriginal language was seen by educators as the major impediment to English literacy proficiency. It is abandoned so that students can be assimilated easily. Hegemonic knowledge and linguistic hierarchies reproduce deformed binaries of logic that frame deficit in my country and yours at the moment. But they do more than this. They order school. They prioritise certain knowledges over another. Lobianco claims the major assimilation deficit approaches in Australia is the move away from bilingual education to English-only literacies. And in Australia, we have what is called the NAPLAN test, that only tests Aboriginal children in English only, not in the 250 different Aboriginal languages that we hear and that you heard me speak. None of Narungga kids are tested in their own languages or are asked if they are numerate, nor are Australian kids tested to see if they are literate and numerate in Aboriginal languages. Put simply, deficit approaches persist, my colleagues, through low student expectation and by devaluing family cultures. The best example that I've come across is Wally Benito's work from New Zealand on Māori student, when a Māori student said, well, most of the teachers tell Pākehā students that their work is not up to standard and they'll need to see their parents if it doesn't improve. They don't say that to us. It's like they don't expect our whānau, our family, to get us going. Thankfully, Aboriginal people have sought to remedy this problem. Despite educational inequality, Aboriginal people saw schooling as one of the most powerful levers to transform injustice and regain Aboriginal identities. Inspiring examples like Narungga Ngauna elder Dr. Alice Rigney, Australia's first school principal, who established with Pat Buskin the first urban Aboriginal school to be responsive to Aboriginal knowledge, linguistic and scientific needs. In 1975, Aboriginal sheer determination in its civil rights movement led to the Racial Discrimination Act in 1975 that spelt the demise of assimilation. And the overturning of the concept of terra nullius done by the Mabo case in 1992 sent curriculum school books at that time who upheld these views to the dustbins of history. In 1992, most books were thrown out of schools that stated that Aboriginal people never lived here. 1992. I now tell my PhD students to be suspicious of any book before the Racial Discrimination Act in 1975 and to tread carefully around anything written before 1992. So, the analysis of how schools reproduce inequality and challenge of decolonisation resonates with a 3-decade-old history of critical post-colonial theory going back as far as Fanon, Freire and Said. Fundamental assumptions of post-colonial understandings of learning and schooling in schooling at this stage by these scholars include theorisations of subjugated knowledges, power and imbalances, bureaucracy and transformation. Most compelling analysis that I've ever read of that power has a pedagogical function was by British analysts Richard Hatcher and Barry Troyner. I'm glad to be back in the country where Troyner acted his craft. Those two argue predominantly influence of student and teacher. The single one that makes a difference is the teacher. I was stunned when I read Barry Troyner's work in my undergraduate days. Power is shared, he said. When the power is shared with student and teacher, this allows the learner to initiate interactions. Solving disparity requires a shift in pedagogies, and he rejected that teachers are mere servants of state hegemony, and that responsive pedagogies do more than just do teach. They are defenders of school as the public good, and they connect education to social change. Social change for cohesion is what our nation requires. That's why I invoke Troyner. And this work has been furthered in the Pacific. Although Troyner has passed, I want to use King's Hall to suggest to you, Barry Troyner, that we have extended your work. So what are theories can we use to decolonise schools and assimilation? Well, Linda Smith's decolonising methodology uses Kokopah Māori theory and claims teachers' methods should be responsive to a diverse range of students, especially the experiences that they bring from home. To address deficits, she suggests in the Pacific that teachers self-reflect on power for grounding questions such as how are problems framed in society? Whose frame do we use? In whose interests are these frames being served? What counts as transformation, and who does transformation to whom, and for what purposes? Her advice to teachers is quite simple. Reduce the epistemological difference between home and school. Troyner, classic argument. In my own writings of Indigenous research epistemology since 1992, I propose 3 sites where pluralism and power sharing must occur before culturally responsive relationships can be built. The emancipatory dimension, I argue. The education must empower. Education must empower. Number 1, tick. Cultural integrity. That culture is relevant to learning. Tick. And the third one, privileging Indigenous voices or minority voices. That teacher dialogic relationships with students improve learning. Dialogic, dialogue. Didactic, the teacher tells the student what to learn. So here I'm taking up the challenge by Hatcher and Troyner to move beyond monocultural pedagogies that is very difficult to do, especially when the entire schooling system in the Pacific is controlled by dominant groups. Cultural responsive pedagogies are critical and anti-colonial. The term decolonisation has many meanings, as highlighted by Graham Ingold-Smith, who argues there are old and new versions of colonialism that masquerade as post-colonial formations, including neoliberalism, commodification of knowledge, and policy manipulation. That said, I agree with Abdi's definition. If colonial systems dehumanise and de-epistemologise Aboriginal children, then decolonisation requires the reconstruction of the continent's learning system that begin with the very least an appreciation of Aboriginal ways of thinking. By invoking Abdi's definition of decolonisation here, I reject any notion for schools to be isolationist or return to a pre-colonial version of learning that is free of European influences. Rather, my objective is quite simple. Decolonisation education must reconstruct learning systems not limited to one segment of our society, but responds to all. In pursuing a decolonising agenda that I'm theorising here, I take up Sleater's argument and proposition that deficit-orientated approaches, whilst most common, are the least helpful. Whilst emancipatory approaches like culturally responsive pedagogies, whilst least common, have the most power to bring about lasting change for cohesion. It is to this global search I want to go. But before I get to the world versions of culturally responsive pedagogies that I suspect you're here for, I want to examine the evidence. Let's go around the world for a quick trip around how Indigenous peoples around the world have been included. And obviously, as you know, the first thing that you would go for is the OECD research, which reported and argued that colonialism undermined young Indigenous peoples' access to their identities, languages and cultures, with catastrophic effects in Australia, Canada and New Zealand. They were just focusing on these three for some reason, and forgot all of the Pacific countries. In the United States, let's start there, the No Child Left Behind policy, the policy aimed to solve disparity. According to Grayboy and Costello, the average reading assessment at 4th grade in 2005 and 2008 saw the average reading scores for Native American youth lower than the scores for their non-Aboriginal components and peers, but very similar to scores of Black and Latino, African Americans and Latino peers. This decline has occurred with significant increases in the use of standardised tests. Stay here in the United Kingdom. The Department for Education established a single equity scheme, you know it, where Michael Gove, Secretary of State of Education, declared the need for the government to raise standards and narrow gaps that require tackling barriers to equal opportunity that bring heavy social and economic costs. And that's right. How it's gone about it is open to conjecture. In New Zealand, let's go to Māori education. New Zealand shows some encouraging signs. If you want to have a look at where closing the gap is really making a difference, you should look here. However, the disparity still exists. In 2016, Māori students had the lowest proportion of students remaining at school by the age of 17, almost 20% lower than Pakeha. A similar picture is happening in Canada. I haven't got time to go into that. In Australia in 2017, the Closing the Gap reported that reported by the Prime Minister showed 6 out of 7 targets not on track. This makes stark reading, my colleagues. The target of halving the gap in child mortality by 2018 is not on track. If your children are dying, as a population, you are in peril. Life expectancy for Aboriginal men like me are 10 years shorter than others. Aboriginal school attempts are 30% behind non-Indigenous children. And out of the literacy and numeracy at years 3, 5, 7 and 9, Aboriginal students are only achieving minimum year 9 numeracy standards. This is since 2008. These stark inequality indicators suggest an overall result of a 10-year period has not improved, in fact went backwards. And despite 50 years of Aboriginal education. But what is of concern is that the patterns of inequality have occurred in Australia, like Canada and the United States. It occurred since the standardisation of high stakes as well. We thought, as scholars, that standardised high stakes testing would bring disparity rates down. We hoped that that's what we were doing. If these disparities were isolated to Australia alone, we could quarantine its effect. But these disparities are worldwide, they are persistent, they are widespread, and they are spreading rapidly. They, in its contemporary condition, are highly under-theorised. And these closing the gap statistics, no matter where they are in the world, are particularly revealing of what happens when culturally responsive pedagogies are not used. Equally problematic is how Closing the Gap campaign focuses on the disparity between black and white, rather than marginalisation of minority languages, knowledges, and aspirations in the system. So it's only, the deficit is to try and get non-Indigenous peoples, minorities, up to a standard of non-Indigenous peoples. Left unanswered or theorised is the marginalisations of Aboriginal languages and where you find them in the system. So since the Closing the Gap campaign began in 2008, Australia has gone for a national curriculum. So here, curriculum, like Canada, United States, and the UK, here curriculum is expected to solve the notion of disparity. And this tactic is really well used around the world, and it's used in the Pacific. Okay, so if we have disparity, the way that we can solve it is through a national curriculum, and we standardise it. This rationale is very, very impressive and costs a lot of money, and does bring some wealth for those who are not succeeding at schools. But the question that I ask of the UK, or for your country and mine, is that will adjustment or inclusion of Aboriginal peoples in the national curriculum solve the Aboriginal disparity? Well, there are serious researchers that have raised some concern, one of them in the room who I hold quite dearly and respect his work. So Buskin argues the absence of content in Australian curriculum. His research shows that 111 Aboriginal content descriptors out of 1,061 are only in subjects like English, math, science and history. Lowe and Younger Porter argue that Aboriginal content is banished from the core, is an optional extra for teachers, and is taught at the discretion of teachers, whilst Troy goes on to criticise English-only regimes that are anti-bilingual. So the national response of the curriculum to the devastating crisis in Aboriginal education is to put Aboriginal content at the margins, not at the core. The question is this a global phenomenon? And sadly it is. So where do we turn for examples of, okay, if curriculum isn't going to do the heavy lifting for us, the only tool that we've got left, according to Troyer, is the teacher. So where do we turn to for culturally responsive pedagogies across the globe? Who's doing this type of work? This is where the edge of the field of minority studies around the world in schooling is at. Empirical studies of teacher behaviour, exceptional empirical studies, I might add, of professional development of teachers to master responsive social cultural pedagogies is evident in the work of Bruner, social constructivist theory, the funds of knowledge by Louis Moll on South American communities, with his terrific work with Gonzalez, Reggio Emilia, student-centered pedagogy by Carlo Rinaldi in Italy, and the social cultural approaches by Rogoff and Vygotsky are all proven that the social cultural aspects work when you implement the funds of knowledge that kids bring to their classroom as the mechanism by which you add new knowledge to their worldview. These studies confirm that cultural responsivity is here to stay. The question is, does it work? Whilst these research are quite extensive, the research, sadly, on cultural responsive education in minorities like Aboriginal children are emergent. So let's quickly do around the globe to see who's doing what. Gloria Ladstone-Billings, Cultural Relevant Pedagogy, recommends to teachers who are working with African American children that she says that the teacher needs to be skilled in 3 ways. So give them some sort of hard things to do. Make them experience success with high expectations, and develop the students' cultural competency of their own, but also cultural competency of others in the class. So she suggests that the students should be educated to challenge the inequities that they are experiencing in society. Native American, let's go to that. Villegas and Lucas found 6 categories that teacher action should happen in order to facilitate a culturally responsive pedagogy. Develop a social cultural conscience. Affirm the views of the students in your classroom, and don't assume that they're that they are homogeneous. Bring change to school to be responsive to all students, regardless of whether they're Aboriginal or minorities. Celebrate the funds of knowledge, and give them learning stretch beyond the familiar. None of these are suggesting, like deficit theories, that we should give things to Aboriginal and minority people that are easy. Aboriginal people don't want that. In New Zealand, let's go to New Zealand. Russell Bishop's work using Kokopau Māori frameworks based on Villegas and Lucas's work, and also Gray, outlines 6 teacher dimensions. Okay, if you're going to teach with minorities, Bishop says, there are some of the things that you need to know if you're going to work in New Zealand. Your education process must teach Māori to be Māori as well as New Zealand. It's not either or, it's both. To be Muslim and to be British is something to be proud of. Power should be shared in the classroom, according to Bishop, and learning is interactive, dialogic, connected, fundamentally include Māori, but more importantly, if you're going to work with us, be mindful that Māori want excellence. Let's go to the United States in my final version of CRP. Costagano and Brayboy and Alaskan Cultural Responsive Teacher Standards have a huge archive that I've read. It provides insights to what the teacher should do. Embrace an encompassing multi-world view. Don't come here teaching your ignorance or your fears. Know theory of how students learn. Teach for diversity. Localise your content. Instruction assessment built on the students' strengths. Learning environments using local sites. Family and community involvement. And engage some quality professional development. The work that most impresses me now, my colleagues, is the work in your country of Janice Wearmouth, who employs cultural responsive pedagogies to foster literacy learning in schools with high populations. What impresses us in the Pacific when we look to her work is that she's working in some of the tough neighbourhoods in your area and is succeeding, but is not being funded to do so. I call upon your governments to fund her work and move this thing forward. And whilst the cultural responsive literature is substantive around promising practices for teachers and students who work with minority children and my children, Aboriginal children, it's not without its limitations. And it's important to acknowledge the limitations of this theory. Sleater notes this work is limited to case studies and program descriptions that are partial in nature and lacks conclusive evidence supporting the case of addressing disparity. And I agree with Sleater's diagnosis. Causal links in this work are weak and only offer very few studies, such as the only one that's really of any interest is when you go to the archive and you read Mathematics and Culture with the Yupik Alaskan communities, which provides strong empirical evidence that a culturally responsive mathematics works with Alaskan Yupik kids. More research is needed, though, whether cultural responsive teaching pedagogies improve student learning. However, despite these concerns, it is my conclusion of this evidence that a congruency exists between the professional development of teachers and the utilisation of student cultures that are critical to success for formal learning. But we simply don't know how deep this penetrates. We know that it makes a difference to the relationships between the teacher and the student. We just simply don't know how that affects teacher learning, especially in secondary schools, where the student doesn't just have one teacher. So you can't measure in social science to see whether this teacher has one effect on the student's academic achievement when they've got so many different variables of teachers in the system. This is the conundrums that I'm facing with my ARC grant in Australia in trying to solve some of these conundrums for the Pacific. Despite these conclusions, my friends and colleagues, that the utilisation of students' cultures are critical for social success and formal learning. In all of these studies, strong teacher, professional development and cultural responsive pedagogies made a positive impact on teacher-student relationship in valuing the funds of knowledge. I would argue that the relationship between teacher-professional development regimes, curriculum and pedagogies are complex, and that more action research is needed that shadow coach teachers for new techniques to change. This action research is the only tool that we can work with teachers as collaborators. Other than that, any other professional development that comes in tells the teacher what to do and then leaves the next day and expects it to be implemented in the school just simply doesn't work. At the moment, I've got action research over 3 years where we've got 2 professors, including me, and a team of 6 working with 25 teachers in the poorest disadvantaged schools in Adelaide. For 3 years, that's what it's going to take. Professional development in my state, in my education department at the moment, sells professional development of an expert coming in, doing an hour, and then leaving and expecting the teachers to implement it the following day and see some result, movement on Adelaide schools of numeracy and literacy. Whilst, in conclusion, cultural responsive pedagogies may have proven to increase positive relationship, it does not offer a total solution to closing disparities. Plurality in this country and across the Pacific is complex and is shifting rapidly. My advice to you today is that it would be unwise for teachers to dispense with the common pedagogies you are using. I do not recommend the privileging over one pedagogy over the other. Rather than cultural responsive pedagogies should complement your existing versions of pedagogies where relevant, My longitudinal research team in Australia has won prestigious grant to test some of these pitfalls, and working with 7 disadvantaged schools, as I said, with teachers and community education officers. Will student learning improve, and can a cohesive society be taught when a teacher's methods uses culture as learning? Whilst we may not have all the scientific data on culturally responsive impact, in a modern world being challenged by diversity, can we afford to be without such research? Aboriginal school student achievement around the globe is achievable. I say to you, with all the eloquence that I can muster, that progress on Aboriginal education is too slow around the world. I urge the education sector of the global north and the south to do more to enable greater and faster gains in minority student achievement. In conclusion, my friends, homeless children are not hopeless. They are homeless. The poor don't lack intelligence, they lack opportunity. Our future is not hate. Schools and teachers build hope. Educating Aboriginal children out of an Aboriginal education is poison. Schools and teachers build hope like universities. And as fellow researchers here today, my colleagues, I ask you to do brave deeds and endure. Thank you very much.
Everybody prepared to take some questions? Is this on? Hello. I, for one, will remember where I was on the 18th of September 2017 for that speech, because that was an incredibly eloquent explication of some of what we're trying to attempt to do here at the Menzies Centre, but also a demonstration, actually, of the extreme topicality and relevance, actually, of what is going on in Australia and the ways in which we think about it for education right here. I know you are often talking about school education. I'm very caught up at the moment in the question of higher education. It's our Freshers Week, as you noticed outside in the corridors. I've been inducting young graduate teaching assistants today, and your speech has given great energy to me to take forward some of the ways in which we have been thinking innovatively here at King's about education, but also demonstrated to me just how far we've got to go. Irabinna said that he's happy to take some questions. We've got a few minutes for questions before I release you to the drinks at the Terrace Cafe. Who would like to ask a question first? If you don't mind, I'm going to pass you. I could sing like someone's going to pass you.
I was really interested in what you had to say about South Australia and the work you've been doing with the 7 disadvantaged schools. I'm actually a South Australian. I was a former secondary school teacher and I've very much worked in Indigenous matters across different sorts of areas. So I'm fascinated whether you're working with Lefevre, and when you talk about culture education, it's about putting Aboriginal ethnicity and culture in the heart of the curriculum. And having friends who are teachers, having been through the teaching regime about pedagogy, just got a whole world back to me. How are you finding about the new breed of teachers that are going through the university systems? Because there's no longer a college of education system where pedagogy, methodology, the whole curriculum was very much front and centre of an educator, a secondary school teacher. That was our education as well as the subject matter. I just wonder the way education has morphed, the way teaching methods have changed, because I've been around the block for about over 30 years and seen education go through all sorts of cycles. And the challenge always is how are you educating, and knowing you're coming from the marginalised groups, Aboriginal education is still very much a marginalised area. It doesn't get, from my recollection, it doesn't seem to get the same focus as other subject matters, because it becomes a question of how is the education taught, what subject matters, what methodology. So when you work with schools and work with teachers who come from all sorts of secondary learning backgrounds, whether it's through a university or through having come through a business and going into teaching as a graduate, how do you find that they're receptive to teaching methodology and pedagogy, and how do you turn their thinking around?
Yeah, this is a really important question, and I thank you for it. We're working with some of the most toughest neighbourhoods in Adelaide, and most of the schools the 7 schools that we're working with, the 25 teachers, the 7 ACEOs, the Aboriginal Education Workers, 3 Aboriginal elders, and the 250 Aboriginal students that they serve inside their schools. We're finding some really, really insightful issues where the teachers that we're working with have confidence in working with minorities. So the schools that we have recruited have no less than 22 minorities within them. So we think that cultural responsive pedagogies work most of the time, but they don't work all the time. One of the interesting things of insights that we said when we, anecdotally at the moment, because we've only been doing it for a year, we'll have more, when I come to King's next year, we'll have at least some data that we can publish and share, which we want to launch that from King's in collaboration with our international partners across the Pacific. That's what UniSA is here for. That's what we pride ourselves on. We're a university of the South. The Pacific, that's our region, our geography, and we're very good at it. And so we want to bring that expertise to King's. But what we find when we ask teachers about, are you comfortable with teaching about diversity? They don't feel like they're very, very competent, even though they've been working in the field for so long. When you ask first-year graduates out, they are very fearful of diverse schools. Anecdotal. So this is a conundrum for us. We've got youngsters that are leaving first year out, that's supposed to be the hope of our country, are fearful for the most diverse, challenging situations that our country has to offer. Now, I haven't seen any research in the UK that talks about first years out whether they're competent to teach multicultural. But if they are uncomfortable with it, this presents a conundrum for us. Teachers love having non-judgmental research by professors and feedback on their classroom practice. I'm in classrooms with these teachers almost every week. So I'm giving them feedback in a non-judgmental way. Has it improved? Absolutely. But I can't prove that it moves their academic numeracy and literacy. That's what I'm struggling with.
I was curious about, you mentioned some of the scholars that have looked at, I think you named a few examples of places where they are using a culturally responsive pedagogy. And just now you were saying that, that you're kind of giving feedback to teachers about how to do that more. Could you give some examples of some of these types of approaches?
Okay, so the first one, yes, sure. So there are 3 approaches that when we did the literature review across the globe, chasing all of these things and trying to get all these scholars in the same room, and we will have them in the same room at King's in November, the second to last week of November. And when we searched that archive, there were about 120 different aspects to culturally responsive pedagogy. We couldn't simply give 120 to teachers to do. So we've synthesised them down into 3 at the moment. And these teachers are helping us theorise. So we've started with 3 and we've got the 7 project in these schools to try and test them out. The first one, give kids something hard to do. Give them something hard to do. And let's see how they go. So don't have deficit views about them. Give them something hard to do and work with them. So that's the first point that we've got in our cultural response pedagogy. The second thing is that the cultures that they bring are positive assets. The third thing that we do with them is that we make sure that the teachers have some skills in techniques to work with kids from diverse backgrounds. So they know a little bit about the diversity that they've got. And then lastly, we try and adapt the national curriculum to ways in which turn kids on from their cultures inside their school. So for instance, at the moment in Salisbury High School, or PIC, Playford International, there's a big Vietnamese population that grows vegetables outside of that school. But none of the curriculum connects to that.
Thank you so much for a brilliant lecture. I've got a question about the difference between schools based in urban centres and more remote communities. Do you think a distinction between these two makes sense, or do you think there needs to be more research done in terms of the teachers and the preparation of the teachers who go into some of the communities or even mining towns? Because I know a few freshly graduated teachers who are totally unprepared, and then they take up these jobs because mainly of the financial security for a little bit, and they go into these places where there is a high majority of Indigenous students, so the ratio there is a bit different in those schools, and they've got no preparation in terms of the curriculum and the knowledge on how to teach to the population there. So do you think there should be a different way of approaching here the curriculum, or in terms also of a national curriculum, does it make sense to make a distinction between those schools and more metropolitan centres? Does it make sense, do you think?
This is terrific. In Australia, we have this really weird situation, right, that you graduate from university, and then you will get a far better wage if you go and work into the interior of Australia, which is pretty much desert, right? So we are elevating teachers to go to some of the most hardest places to teach in remote areas. And we pay them a lot of money to do it, and yet they're the least experienced. Yet we're sending them to some of the most highly challenging situations. So Australia has it wrong. It really needs to rethink about where it's going to go. The other interesting thing about your question is in the Northern Territory, Western Australia, and Queensland, South Australia, all have every single criterion from remote, urban, rural, desert, very, very remote, right? Sometimes you're driving 3 days to get to the community, right? So it's very, very remote. And the curriculum in universities at the moment don't really make a distinction between Australians who are remote, black or white. Most Australian kids in the interior of Australia up into the 1970s were educated by the School of the Air on radio. And most of the kids at the moment are being schooled in remote areas online. And these two technologies to impart knowledge are imperfect. You cannot replace the teacher. They are required. And so I think the university system has to do more in terms of how we do for our remote issues. The only, if you graduate, you get a, I think it's right, Peter, you get a 2-day training course before you go out into the desert, instead of the 4-year training, for black or white. And so Australia is the size of the United States, right? With 22 million people, right? In Italy we're not that. But 2 days to learn how to teach black and white remote kids who are 48 hours from England.
Time for one more question.
Might be more a comment than a question. I'm a teacher from New South Wales. Spent some time working in Western New South Wales and schools up to 75% Indigenous students. The huge impact that I've seen in recent years, of what you kind of made mention of, is map planning, is the amount of stress that is now placed on teachers, where in the early days we used as a diagnostic tool. The constant thing now, we are compared from school to school at the map plan level, and then also New South Wales license certificate results. It's really changed the nature of our classrooms, I feel, because I love my time at West New South Wales, and you were able to really involve yourself in teaching the whole child, knowing the community, you're part of the community, you're part of sporting teams. And I just found the further east I moved, the more disengaged you became from that thing. And then with the NAPLAN, and once it got published in the public forum, it just made such a difference.
Yeah, Teresa McCarthy's work in Arizona, that works with Navajo, states that when you've got standardised testing that puts stress on teachers, teachers don't get to do multicultural education or diversity or cohesion studies because they're too busy trying to get what the department wants them to do. So standardised tests, whilst may be useful and are useful, they are occupying more time of the teacher and the principal, and therefore the teacher and the principal don't have any other time to do anything else. So it actually limits the curriculum and causes stress. You heard the evidence. The evidence suggests that in a 10-year period where education has gone backwards in Australia for Aboriginal kids, this has been during the highest standardised testing regime. And I'm looking at my 7 principals and my 25 teachers who I'm working with, and they are stressed. And I feel that my research is in position. They are busy people, but they also want to make a difference. Multiculturalism, cohesion versus standardised testing, that's where it's at, and then making a choice. Teresa McCarthy's evidence, Navajo kids off on reserve, not getting any Aboriginal culture because standards testing is taking too much time at the teacher.
Just ask you, how many Indigenous Australian or Aboriginal teachers do you think you have just in South Australia who are actually there as part of the community, teaching the community? Sorry, Ian, I just want to... It's a much simpler question than everyone else's. I'm curious.
10 years ago, it was below 0.5%. Professor Buskin's work with Nasidi, More Aboriginal Teachers Project, has increased some of those. But we're sitting just under 1.2% at the moment, but we're wanting to try and raise that as fast as we can. But equally, we want to try and educate more teachers in culturally responsive pedagogies, because Muslim kids, Aboriginal kids, Buddhist kids are in public schools and are taught by non-Indigenous peoples in the land. And so therefore you have to educate your teacher workforce of how to cater for diversity, not to be scared of it.
Thank you, Irabinna. You've taught us not only so much about culturally sensitive teaching, but also just the sheer significance of teaching and what a significant figure the teacher is in our culture, and something that I think it's important we're all reminded of every day. I want to thank the University of South Australia for bringing such a custodian of knowledge to us in the north to hear such amazing research, and I'm really looking forward to continuing to work with you as we develop the knowledge exchange here at King's College London. I want to thank everybody for coming, and to direct you when you finish applauding out the door over there, where we will give you some directions down to the Terrace Cafe, where we have some canapes and drinks waiting for you. But finally, please join me in thanking the inaugural David Unaipon lecturer, Professor Rigney. Thank you.